Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. Hello, if you're listening to this and you are a patron, thank you. We are so grateful for your support. The 7th series is currently under construction. Dave is wearing his yellow hat, and we will give you updates about the upcoming release on the Patreon page. Go to patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. If you're not a patron and listening to this, that's because we released it later in the main feed. Hello! Please do consider supporting us via our Patreon, where you can get extra content. That's patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. This episode is all about Flappy Flaps. We talked to the paleontologist who described the massive new Jurassic Scottish pterosaur that made the headlines back in February 2022. So, hello and welcome to Terrible Lizard Super Flappy Flap Special. I believe that's what we're going to do. It is Pterosaur Special Central. I have been joined by not one, but two pterosaur specialists. One is, your average Dr. Dave Hone. You've met him before. He's lovely. But the other one is, well, actually, Dave, I'm going to let you introduce, because once again, I don't know many Flappy Flap experts, and you've met Natalia before, so I want you to introduce her, and then she can introduce herself with all the things that you've got to say.
There, you put me on the spot now because I was expecting you to do the introduction rather than me.
The main reason that I haven't done it is because I have no idea how to pronounce Jagielska.
It's Jagielska.
It's
Jagielska. There we go.
Yes.
So I was going to get Dave to do that because this is the first time I've met, and I've only referred to her in our conversation as Natalia. So, yeah.
Natalia, not Phil Jagielska. I don't know. He was an Everton footballer.
Was he? Yeah, because that's my pterosaur knowledge. It's right up there with Everton footballers.
Obviously. No, Natalia's doing her PhD in Edinburgh and has recently sprung to fame because on top of all of her really very, very cool art, which I definitely want to talk about at some point, is responsible. You talk about names you can't pronounce. I'm not going to dare pronounce it because I haven't heard anyone involved in the paper say it yet. There's a wonderful grammatical sentence. Responsible for the new giant Scottish Rhamphorhynchine, which at time of recording came out like 3 or 4 weeks ago, so it's very, very new, which is pronounced as
Dearc Sgiathanach, and I might be saying it incorrectly as well, because it's in Scottish Gaelic, which is not my native language, and it's not a very accessible language, because, the Gaelic languages are nothing like Slavic or English languages I know, so I might be butchering it completely. I had one native Gaelic speaker say it once, and I don't have a pre-recorded version to say, so I hope I'm saying it correctly. It's Dearc Sgiathanach, and I'm sorry to 20,000 or something native Gaelic speakers, because I might be butchering it.
I think as long as you mumble the first bit, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Dearc Sgiathanach. There you go.
Very, very cool animal. Because, not to steal with Natalia's thunder, but we talked about Rhamphorhynchus a bit, and, the biggest Rhamphorhynchus that I know of, which is a specimen I'm working on, I think we touched on it, is 1.80 m-ish in wingspan, and that was as big as we thought these non-pterodactyloid pterosaurs could actually get. And then this thing has come along, which is A, British, which we don't get many British pterosaurs, and when we do, they're bits. So A, it's British, B, it's really very well preserved. There's an awful lot of it, and it's in 3D, which you don't get very much. And then it's absolutely colossal at 3-ish meters in wingspan. So, 50% plus above what we thought was the upper limit for size in these animals. So it's really very interesting. And as Middle Jurassic as well?
It is Bathonian in age from Middle Jurassic, so yeah.
So it's older than any of the other really big ones. So, yeah, it's for someone who really likes his Rhamphorhynchines, this is a big deal. So I'll shut up and let you talk about it.
Yeah, so it's... I've been working for it for 3 years, which is scary because Dave has been working on Pterosaurs for almost as long as I am alive, so...
Good to rub that in. That's a good thing to rub in.
We're cutting this off now.
No.
But no, it's scary because I've been just working on Pterosaurs for 3 years. It's a brand new thing for me. I never worked on anything like this previously, and it has been intimidating because I'm dealing with something very, very special. We haven't had this kind of style of preservation in Britain and that kind of Pterosaur in 200 or so years. The last well-preserved crania with postcrania in pretty good condition of quite unique Pterosaur was Dimorphodon, discovered by Mary Anning in early 19th century. And suddenly there's this new thing from Middle Jurassic of Scotland, which is not a cradle of well-preserved fossils, and also from Middle Jurassic, which is a blank spot in a lot of terrestrial fauna.
So I was just wondering, where was it found? Why was it found? When was it found? Why are you describing it now? All the things.
Yep. Okay. So I was still an undergrad when it was found. I was on the same island, but I was doing different work as guys that were discovering it. So it was part of 2017 National Geographic trip to Skye. We know Skye has a lot of Middle Jurassic deposits, overall Jurassic deposits. It's a very good location for fossil hunting, and it has a lot of footprint sites. So one of the master students there was doing photogrammetry of footprint sites, which had ornithopods, stegosaur, theropod footprints on the platform on Skye.
We're not allowed to mention stegosaurs. That's one of the rules. No stegosaur footprints or anything like that. So,
no stegosaurus. Stegosaurs are fine, yeah.
Okay,
you're loosening it now. That's good to know.
Okay, the tracks were deltapodus, which means might belong to a stegosaurid type of animal.
But all of these tracks, they were very, they're all second...
Traces.
Trace fossils, there we go.
They're things that the animal left, but the actual animal itself. We have some bits and bobs of theropods and things like that on Skye, but it's usually just one single bone, a bit of a single bone. And while the team was mapping that location with the footprints, one of the PhD students back then, Amelia Penny, was just looking at the ground and noticed something popping out of the limestones. Like, that looks interesting. And the artist, John Hodd, was there, came over and was like, that looks like a pterosaur skull. And we sort of came over and was like, oh, there's definitely something here. And when they started putting it out, oh, there's a bit of a wing. There's another bit of a wing. We might have an actual full skeleton intact. And the bad thing is, it was on a tidal platform. So the tide was moving in, and they had to cut this very delicate fossil. And it's from limestone. Limestone is a hell to cut out. It's not as nice and fissile, so it doesn't really break easily. You have to get a diamond-tipped saw to get it out in time. So the fossil had to be covered by tide, because sadly we cannot control the nature. It has already been exposed for tides for hundreds of years now, because when you look at the fossil itself, tide cut most of its head. Actually, I have this small, I know podcasts are a terrible thing for visual representation, but I'm holding a small skull, and when you look at the skull, you can see how the tide cut it in half. There's like this entire straight margin, and you can see the water just sort of moving and slowly eroding it away.
I mean, it could have just been a really aerodynamic pterosaur. It's got a really smooth top of head.
It is for the people listening rather Concordy. I mean, they do have rather pointed noses as it is, but this version with the top kind of slit off has become extremely Concorde nose shaped.
And it doesn't have any eyes, so.
And that's just coastal abrasions. That's the sand and everything just wearing it down over a few years.
The erosion has destroyed a lot of the wings and a lot of the skull and bits of the cervical, so the neck. But because if that erosion didn't happen, we wouldn't be spotting it in the first place. But it was cut out. It was carried by a team of a lot of men. It was a very heavy limestone slab. I'm glad I was not around, because I'll be just standing in the background just thinking, I'm not a good person to lift it up. But it was put into University of Edinburgh, and I waited a PhD student to come along and describe it. And here I am, the PhD student. And I sort of got it almost accidentally, because I saw there's an advertisement for work to be done on Skye Jurassic deposits. It's something that I did during my undergrad years, and something that will look at scanning bones using CT scans and other chemical traces. Like, I already did that for my master's, so I applied. My CV matched exactly the project, and suddenly I'm studying pterosaurs, something I never studied previously. So first year, it was just learning anatomy from ground up, because I'm not a biologist, I'm a geologist. And 3 years on, I'm publishing, I think it feels like, it's just a few PDFs, like maybe 5-page PDF, and like, that took me a few years. I should be happy, but it's just like, that's quite a lot for a short document. But it's out.
Very cool. I want to ask you though, because you are a geologist, you've admitted to it now. So why has this preserved? What is it about this particular rock that has allowed it to preserve when there are so few fossils to be found on Skye? What is the chemical thing that's happening here?
I wish I could answer that question. I asked a lot of geologists, but everybody's sort of flabbergasted. Things like this usually don't happen in fossil record. We have some anomalies of certainly well-preserved pterosaurs in the individual deposits, but 3D preservation of pterosaurs is a rarity. Usually, if that happens, it's usually around specific formations like Romualdo Formation in Brazil, which protects fossils in 3 dimensions because they're formed in nodules, or something like Sulfogen or Holzmadden, which have very specific chemistry, which allow the visit preservation. But that's not really the case for the Scottish Formation. Also, the Scottish Formation, the Large Formation, is not very accessible. Like, it's tidal, it's very hard to cut out. There might be a lot of interesting things, but it's not a best location for easy fossil collecting. So it might be a graveyard of pterosaurs, but it's not a good place to just go in and, break some slabs and take them home. But still, it's interesting. Things like this don't happen, and it's weird because we have this trackside of theropods, ornithopods walking around. Above it, there's a shell deposit of maybe storm level base. So we had a storm moving in and destroying things. And then we have the pterosaur on top of it. And it's fully articulated with almost in vivo position. So the wings and the entire body lies as it would lie in normal life. So there's no disarticulation, no evidence of some kind of
squashed
energy. Yeah. It's still in 3 dimensions, but some of the elements are better 3D preserved than others. So one humerus is 3D, other one is very badly crushed. No idea why it's so localized.
But you get these weird things, though. So, I mean, we're obviously lucky that an area where, we've done a fair bit of exploration. Skye is a big place for geologists to go as students and look at stuff.
A lot of students.
Yeah, well, quite. But then you've got things like, I think back to Pteranodon, where we've discussed this, 1,000, 1,200 specimens, and they're basically all flat. And then there's this one that's actually in Ottawa that I'm hoping to work on. So if Jordan Mallon's listening, remember, we're supposed to be working on that one. And this one Pteranodon is almost perfect. It's as 3D and well preserved as I've ever seen any Pteranodon, and yet it's also disarticulated. So it's clearly rotted a bit and started to fall apart, and yet hasn't been squished or scavenged or any of the things which happen to even the good ones. So yeah, you can just get lucky. And my guess is in the case of Dearc that we've got lucky in the sense that it just happens to have preserved one really good pterosaur, and then we happen to have found it relatively early on, and we might not find another one this good for another century.
I'm working on something else, saying that there might be more stuff coming from Skye that might be quite delicate. So be on the lookout.
You've heard it here first.
Well, there is some to name drop another terrible lizards guest. So Elsa Pancreoli has worked on some of the Middle Jurassic mammals from up there. So we had Elsa on 3 or 4 series back talking about Mesozoic mammals, and yeah, I know there's some other stuff up there that she's looked at. So I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, if there's more material this complete of anything, not just pterosaurs, that would be very, very cool. Because so many people have looked at Skye. Like, we should have, if there were lots of good deposits there, we should kind of spotted them by now.
Yeah, I hope it's not just a lightning in a bottle kind of situation for pterosaur, because there's some evidence of disarticulation, especially around the thoracic area. So a lot of the vertebra and ribs are disarticulated, which is quite common in even well-preserved deposits in Holzmaden. So maybe there has been some kind of decomposition within the thoracic area, some kind of implosion, because you have a lot of gases in this area. So there might be something, but there's nothing indicating high energy movement or anything with our specimen. So either we are very, very lucky, and maybe it was just a muddy interval and was quickly buried by lime or something else. But I hope that's not just like an isolated incident, and there might be something about the chemistry of that location that might preserve pretty well, more well-preserved specimens. And I'm working on some other things which might shed some light on it. Sadly, they're not as amazing as Dearc, but there are some other things coming from a location. Also, just ahead, if people want to go, we can go to Brothers Point, but there's not a lot of infrastructure to support mass fossil excavation there. It's an area of scientific importance, and already there's a lot of footpath erosion and things of a lot of people going, because it has already been in press about, the footprints, everyone wants to see them, but it's not like Jurassic Coast. There's no people protecting that area, and it's not really open for tourism. So if you want to go some fossil hunting, I recommend it, but be wary of their environment, because it's not ready for, slow of fossil scientists and hunters. I love it, but be careful.
I mean, it could be that this particular pterosaur was out fossil hunting and slid off a cliff because of the tourist erosion by other pterosaurs, and ended up perfectly preserved, splatted on the floor, and everything piled on top of it.
Did it have a little hammer with it?
Yeah.
It was already heavily eroded area, because you have so many dinosaurs coming around. It was clearly a footpath back then as it is now.
Well, yeah, you spoke about the fact that you've got all of these, tracks of dinosaurs, these trace fossils of dinosaurs plodding about, and then there was a storm and they all got covered, and then it's this next layer that you get this perfect. What does that tell us about this animal or the environment or anything? Do we know anything? Is there anything significant about that?
Okay, so we know this area was a partially exposed area, so we know it had very high filtration of waters and also high filtration of salinity. So sometimes it was fully exposed to the elements. So we have dissertation crash showing it was exposed to the earth. We had dinosaurs moving when the water was low, and the water sort of rised and fell, and it was very close to the coastline because we had a lot of storm influence. So we know that was pretty biologically active area that had pretty wide margin of being either terrestrial or suddenly marine, and within quite short amount of time span for that to happening. So maybe that was the reason it's so well preserved. Maybe it sort of formed this kind of short-lived anoxic interval of sort of big puddle that sort of was stagnant, allowed preservation of this weird animal. It's really hard to tell. It's not a good place to do stratigraphic logging, which is something that geologists do to study transition of environments. So we basically look at different strata as it stacks on top of each other. Because the platform, it's so heavily eroded, the strata buildup is quite hard to ascertain because you can't really easily see the individual strata going up. So
you can't see the layers of the cake. It's too mixed up and it's too eroded. Somebody's put icing all the way around your cake and you can't see the layers anymore.
Or you just ate the cake and then we just have the base of it.
Yeah.
But that in itself, I was just going to say that I think people think we know everything, and particularly for well-studied areas. And yeah, as we said, Skye, it is like the location that all geology undergraduates in the whole of the UK go to every single year and have done for like at least 50 years. You would think that we go, oh yeah, the stratigraphy of Skye. We know that. No, we still don't know that. And that's the bit which is, I would argue, Skye is probably more intensely studied than any other bit of UK of that equivalent size.
We should
and yet we don't know.
Tell, because like I know where Skye is, you guys know where Skye is, but we've got a lot of American listeners who are just like, is that in London? Because I know you're like that, American listeners.
What, that accent? Jesus.
So, yeah, exactly like that. Is it in Illinois? No, Skye is north of, so you've got the islands of like Scotland and England and Wales, that bit of Britain, and it's north of that. It's one of the Outer Hebrides, is that what you call it?
It's one of the Hebrides.
Yeah. It's the Hebrides, not the Outer Hebrides.
Yes, it's the Hebrides.
That's the thing, the Outer Hebrides are outside of the Hebrides, so yes.
Whatevs. Anyway, it's up north, basically, and if you go there in summer, it's great because the days last for years, and if you go there in winter, you've got about 4 hours of sunlight, and then you can't do any more digging.
Yeah.
But when you go during the summer, you'll find midges. And midges are hell.
Oh.
And there's a lot of midges and ticks and snakes.
Scottish midges are just...
bite you.
Yeah.
No, it's what... like, the biting itself doesn't hurt, but the bite itself, just, it feels for weeks. It doesn't leave. And, they're like the worst thing. You might think, it's the wind, it's the water. I love it when it's raining on Skye, because at least midges are not around. You're happy when the weather is slightly worse.
So same thing when I've been in Canada and the mosquitoes are out. It's like when it rains, the mozzies don't fly, and it's like, oh, it's heaven. I
had a friend who I think did a camping trip to Alaska, and she said she had to learn how to pee in a tent because the mosquitoes are so bad you just couldn't leave the tent to do it.
Yeah, I've been in conditions of that, and I've heard tales of people working up in the northern forests in Canada where black fly, and I've seen photos, and like it's like someone's been had their arm painted black, like with biting flies, and you're just like, no, sod that. I'm never ever going there in summer. Just unimaginable conditions.
So, I mean, it's good to know. I like to think of you guys as, it's not so much Indiana Jones as, some sort of bug spray is needed rather than a whip. But, it's still quite a rugged look for a geologist, paleontologist going out to the cliff face. But you didn't do that, did you? You just went to Edinburgh.
She sat in a museum and waited for someone to hand it over.
Exactly. That's not,
It's It's the least rewarding, but by far the easiest way of doing research.
To be honest, like half of my research was looking at collections from the 19th century, because we have the amazing buffering specimen. We have to compare to something else of the same time, and looking for us, there's a lot of pterosaur stuff from the same time period, but from Oxfordshire, from the Tainton limestone or Stansfield slate, and it's tens of different pterosaur remains, but usually just, a wing bone, a femur. It's a bit of scraps, but it's a lot of scraps. It is, I sort of reach out to contextualize our specimen within those scraps, and it's really interesting because we have a lot of big stuff there, even bigger than the Ark, in a very, very different than the Ark. So Middle Jurassic was an exciting period for pterosaurs in Britain, but sadly it just showcases that taphonomic biases just sort of eroded, and we have to use those scrappy material to reconstruct the environment back then. But we had very diverse, very large pterosaurs back then, those scraps tell us, and the Ark is just one of them, representing maybe even one of the smaller versions of living around that period.
A smaller one. It's 50% larger than any Rhamphorhynchus species that we found, and you think it's not the biggest out there?
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
It's one of those things that again really changes your perspective as a long-term researcher. But also that point Natalia was just making about comparisons. Things like single finger bones or something like an ulnar or something like a foot bone. They're in pterosaurs, they are pretty unremarkable, and they all look like each other. And it's only a few things like the femur, the humerus, maybe a nice bit of the neck bone, apart from the skull, that is really how we tell most of them apart. If you've only got bits, if you've got whole skeletons, we can look at things like the ratios of various lengths of bones, and that turns out to be very important. But if you've just got bits, here's an odd humerus, here's an odd femur. Well, okay, but we've also got this weird, this odd ulnar and this odd tail and this odd wing. Maybe that's one animal, and then we've just found these 8 different bits and they all go together. But if you then get something like Dearc, and you can go, oh, that doesn't match, and that doesn't match, and that doesn't match, and that doesn't match, we at least know that you've got 2, and probably several. And so that, again, we talked about this with the Alvarezsaur episode we did, where we had these old bits knocking around in Europe that people even thought were owls. And it's only when you get a whole skeleton and you're like, now everything falls into place and I've got some context. So yeah, again, that point is really well made, that it's not just we've got a cool new animal, it's also, and it allows us to go back and look at this other stuff which previously was remarkable in its size but otherwise basically meaningless, and now we can say something useful about it.
Well, what can we say about it? Tell me about this lovely Flappy Flap Rhamphorhynchus thing.
Okay, so Dearc has very slender bones. We look at it, it's quite, its wings, despite it being quite large, are quite slender. But when you go to Stansfield's collections, we find much, much more robust, like twice the thickness and size, different wing phalanges that clearly are very, very different. So there is other very robust, large pterosaurs, similar to Dearc, but definitely not Dearc, around within the same area in the same environment. But our Dearc, it's suddenly when I started describing, it's like, oh no, that's another Rhamphorhynchoid. We have a lot of them. So it's not something super exciting. It's like, oh, we have Dearc Naphis on one side, we have Rhamphorhynchus on the other side, and they're quite well represented. So like, we don't have exciting like 3D preserved Dimorphodon or Wukongopterid or something that we don't have any 3D preservation of. And we have something that we know quite a lot of. But still, it's from Middle Jurassic. It makes bridges that gap from Dearc Naphis to Rhamphorhynchus. And even those, we have no idea how they connect, if they are related to each other, or does the one goes into Schiphognathids, which are slightly different pterosaurs, and if Rhamphorhynchus is slightly different, because Rhamphorhynchoids are quite specific, especially Rhamphorhynchus. It has very weird humerus, which is not seen in any of the non-pterodactyloids. It has very specific skull shape. So it's a very specialized, within non-pterodactyloid animal, like the Rhamphorhynchus, which makes it kind of hard to compare pterosaurs to it, because Rhamphorhynchus is super specific, but has hundreds of well-preserved specimens in 3D. And we have this other 3D preserved specimen, which it's not like Rhamphorhynchus, but there's nothing else to compare it to, because there's not a lot of other pretty preserved pterosaurs that have full crania and postcrania. So you are reliant to make comparisons of just this one clade, which is well preserved. But like, this is a very specific animal from late Jurassic, and this is another animal from Middle Jurassic. So comparing them has been hellish with that. We have the only two things I can compare, so I will compare them. But like, they're quite different animals, and it showcases how Paranthropus is much, much more specialized compared to all of our pterodactyloids, because our pterosaur has humors that's quite similar to one Indorognathus and Scapognathus, which were early and late Jurassic, kind of boxy-headed, kind of smaller pterosaurs. But it also has, unlike those boxy-headed, its jaw is very, very long. It's like a Deutschland of pterosaurs. It has, even with the erosion, you can see how long and elongated it was. The head was almost as long as most of its body, which is exciting because it's something we see only further up with pterodactyloids and modern pterosaurs. So that's kind of exciting. But otherwise, the dentition looks very rhamphorhynchoidish, so we assume they had quite similar diet, with kind of fangs at the front and smaller pegs in the back. It has super well preserved pteroid and ectopterygoid, which is this fancy area in the middle inside of the skull.
Its nose.
It's what goes into the nose.
Kind of palate.
Palate. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's like the nasal cavity.
Yes, so basically the area between your nose and top of your mouth, and it's super well preserved. It's a very complicated area, and it's quite big. Usually when you have tiny pterosaurs, those tiny slits inside the bone just get disarticulated and broken, are missing. But in our case, entire skull is still in calcite slab, and we scanned it with CT, so we know its internal structure quite well in all dimensions we can look out for. So
you can actually scan it. You don't actually have to dig it out, so that it was scanned with the calcite.
We didn't dig it out because it's too fragile, and it started cracking. So most of it. It's sadly in the rock. So you show it to someone's like, "Oh, I'm holding something that's just like a rock." But when you start CT scanning and manual segmenting it, suddenly you have a full, pretty preserved skull, and it also has hyoid and basset hyoid, which are the tongue bones still encased lying. So it's super, super exciting because if we started preparing more, those small struts will be just falling apart and being disarticulated. But in this case,
I have a very nerdy question about type of rocks you can CT and type of rocks you can't CT, because presumably there is going to be some where because we're looking at the mineral deposits inside a rock, and the minerals are actually in that rock as well. Otherwise, it wouldn't have turned into a fossil. So what type of rocks are good for this and bad for that? CT scanning.
The best thing is to have high contrast in density, which sadly Pterosaur doesn't have. Its bones are from calcite, and it's in limestone, which is mainly calcite, and the slab has a lot of pyrite, which is super, super dense, fool's gold metal. So it has been hellish to CT scan it because the contrast between them is very, very low, especially area when we have the thicker rock. We tried to do CT scanning of entire slab, but absolutely nothing came out because there's just too much calcite on calcite.
Sorry, I was going to say, I'm surprised you could get as much as you can, because I know pterosaurs in particular, I mean, I know it's an easy thing to say as a pterosaur researcher, is like, oh yeah, you think other stuff's bad, but pterosaurs are really bad. And this is one of the aspects where that's genuinely true, because you want that density difference, and not only have you got the problem that Izzy already mentioned and Natalia's already explained, that they are very similar in density because they're fundamentally the same rock, but being pterosaurs, they have these ludicrously hollow thin bones that are pneumatic, so the bone itself, which of course is now rock, is very thin, and then what usually ends up filling them is the rock as well. So you've now got a big block of rock, a very, very, very thin bit of small pterosaur bone made of almost the same rock, and then the same rock inside it again. And curiously enough, our CT scans of pterosaurs are rubbish.
It's like the black button that lights up black to let you know you've pressed it.
Yeah, pretty much. It's because at least with, a big dinosaur, say, even something hollow like a big theropod, you've probably still got a centimetre thick of bone, whereas we're talking about a fraction of a millimetre with the same rock inside and out. Yeah, they don't CT scan, basically.
Yeah, I'm amazed that you've managed it, because the skull that you keep holding up is it looks fragile, it looks incredibly, the fact that you've got all those tiny little bones inside it is incredible. And
they just don't preserve. Again, there was a paper, I was going to say last year, and then my brain starts running and go, about 6 years ago, But they did like I can't remember who did it. I think it was one of the Brazilian teams, and they did like a survey of pallets in pterosaurs, and there were like 12 out of 250 years of digging. And so to have one that's not just preserved, full stop, and visible, but also, by the way, in 3D, again, is just like, okay, you're getting into real minutiae. You've got to be a proper pterosaur nerd to appreciate a good rhamphorhynchine pallet. But still, like, these things they barely exist. Like, the fossil record of them is appallingly awful.
What do they tell you, though? What does the palate actually tell you? I mean, you've talked about the sort of, presumably the hyoid bones tell you about the sort of tongue, maybe, that it wasn't like, it didn't have a massive tongue that sort of shot out and picked up fish.
The tongue, it's hyoids and basal hyoids, which are bones which we have preserved actually in this lab, and it's a bone that's not usually articulated with the rest of the skull. It's lying underneath it, and they're quite hook-shaped. They're not in this one because it's a different set of bones, so the palatal doesn't tell us anything about the tongue, but can tell us something about olfaction, which is the ability to smell things, and canals that are going within the brain itself. But sadly, if we have just small sample size, that's kind of useless because we have nothing to compare it to. So we can compare it to other animals, but pterosaurs are quite unique in their own style. And that'll be kind of hard to do good interpretations, especially with, in our case, erosion has taken much of the nares and other bones that will be lying on top of it, so we can't reconstruct the cavities. So you can only describe the anatomy of it and wait for other specimens to come over and use it as a jumping off point for
I just
more
think
research.
that's lazy. I just think you don't want to write that chapter. I think that's what that is. You just don't want to investigate, like, well, the way that they used to smell, because they have to... I still really hope that one day we discover somehow massive flowers. We find out that pterosaurs were actually hummingbirds and they all had really long tongues that they dipped in. And the rest of it was just for pruning and showing off. That's why all the gnashy teeth.
Some of the hyoids in pterosaurs actually have kind of similarities to one in chameleons. There's one study suggesting they could have chameleon-like tongues, although it's kind of questionable from that conclusion.
I'm happy. This is true now. This is true in my head.
So I will pick up on this because this is one of these things that you get after so many years in pterosaur research that other people weren't born when you started. Though I think that's not actually true because I didn't really start on pterosaurs until 2002, and you're definitely older than 20. But so Liu Jun Chang, who was a wonderful researcher and a very good friend, and very sadly passed away 4 years ago now, something like that. So we talked about anurognathids. So Luopterus was a new taxon I named in his memory a while ago. And when I was based in China, I saw quite a lot of him, unsurprisingly, though slightly surprisingly, because if you understand Chinese paleontology politics, I was based in one institute and he was based in the rival institute. And we basically used to have to go out for lunch together in a place where neither set of researchers would see us hanging around. But he sent me a draft of a paper he was writing where he's talking about, the hyoids in pterosaurs. And it's basically said, look, they're chameleon-like. There's a photo of his pterosaur hyoid and a photo of a chameleon hyoid. And I basically wrote back and went, no, they're not. They're completely different. They look nothing like each other. Because he said, they're both Y-shaped, which they are. Only two fairly minor points here. Firstly, most hyoids in reptiles are Y-shaped. So this isn't really a big surprise that pterosaurs and chameleons both have Y-shaped hyoid. And secondly, chameleons, if you imagine the Y, the long bit of the Y, the kind of base of it, in chameleons is enormous, with a tiny little pair of stubs to make the Y. And in his pterosaur, it was the exact opposite, with a giant Y and then a tiny little stub at the end. And he went, look, they're the same. And I'm like, mate, don't publish that. They're completely different. They look nothing like each other. And that pterosaur one isn't even unique to pterosaurs. Every pterosaur hyoid I've ever seen looks like that. But he stuck it out anyway in a Chinese journal. And since then, there has been this, pterosaurs had chameleon tongue. And they really, really didn't.
But it would have been cool if that's how they caught fish, though, Dave.
Yes, it would.
With long, sticky tongues that somehow had some sort of sucker at the end of it. You could just, reel in a fish.
Yes.
That would, it makes so much sense.
Yes, but they didn't. But there was, Natalia, you wasn't there a paper 2-3 years ago now where someone actually finally got around to doing a proper review of pterosaur hyoids and covered this?
Yep, it's pretty good, but hyoid doesn't tell us anything different. It's similar to Scapognathus. It's not Y-shaped, it's just a gentle J that sort of goes inside, and it's nothing exciting, but I'll be writing that detailed osteology that sort of goes into details of hyoids and other structures, because there's some interesting things in the school, which if you read the paper that we did, we basically go barely into the osteology or morphology, because there's some quite interesting stuff going on, which I won't spoil, that will explore in other in follow-up paper, because it does some weird things that I haven't seen pterosaurs done previously, but also nobody did a proper good CT scan of a Jurassic pterosaur skull, so also the weird things I'm observing might be general things across the clade, but just nobody else did them previously. So there's some interesting things going within the jaws, but I will not be spoiling them yet.
Boo! I was one of the academic referees for this paper, and so when we did the Rhamphorhynchus episode, and I said a couple of very cryptic things along the lines of, and Rhamphorhynchus is the biggest non-pterodactyloid pterosaur that we know of at the moment, because it couldn't, it's one of these things you get trapped into ethically, where it's like, I can't ethically say to our lovely listeners, it's the biggest non-pterodactyloid pterosaur, when I know full well it isn't, but I also can't reveal knowledge about a paper which I'm not an author on and has a press embargo on it. So I fully accept and understand I'm not going to tell you what it is, but that's also extremely annoying. Tell us. We'll edit it out honest.
I'll keep it with Twitter DMs.
So what else about this? Do you have, I know we've got, it's lost its top of its head and a bit of its neck and stuff. Do we have its tail?
We have its tail. It's sadly also covered by calcite vein, but it's one of the elongate tails that we usually associate with non-pterodactyloids. So it was supported by elongate struts and zygaphysis, and the front of it is made of like rudders, so like 3 or 4 different bones that are square, and the rest of the tail is kind of robust and quite long and supported by out of interligament struts. So we know it sort of used the tail like a rudder with the maneuverability at the front, and then it's sort of being quite stiff, and it still had a lot of elasticity, but it was not really, a flowy dragon-like tail. So
does it have those? Because I know Rhamphorhynchus has a sort of fan, which isn't a fan, I know, but it has that at the back. Does it have one of those?
We have absolutely no soft tissue preservation in our pterosaur, which is kind of common for 3D preserved animals. Usually, the soft tissue is preserved well when animals kind of squished. In our case, there's absolutely nothing that suggests we have any soft tissue, but most likely it had some kind of decoration on the tail, but no idea if it was a small flowery one like we find in Wukongopterids or Stardies, so the one that sort of looks like I don't know, like a bunk.
Well, an oar is what I'd usually say. So you've got a kind of relatively long and kind of paddle-like structure on a beam, and then Rhamphorhynchus juveniles have a little diamond, and the adults have a big triangle.
So it could be either of those, but we can't. Or maybe it was heart-shaped or something different that the adult was completely unaware of.
It caught fish with its tongue and it had a heart-shaped tail. This is.
I mean, I'm sure we're missing a ton of diversity of pterosaur tail veins, because I'm pretty convinced they're display structures, or at least partly display structures.
Because if Sardis can have such a very, very different structure compared to something like Rhamphorhynchus, despite being so close to each other with time, and that definitely shows there has been some weird diversity within those tails.
And then you've got the its name's dropped out of my head, the Caesarchus thing, Pterorhynchus, and then Pterorhynchus with this bizarre saw-toothed tail, which looks ridiculously unaerodynamic, and in fact must be unaerodynamic. So we've got 6-7 taxa with good tail veins, and we've got 4 completely different morphologies. That's head crest territory. That's telling you it's not functional. It's not functional in a biomechanical sense. It's doing something weird. So I can easily imagine this thing's got something random as hell on the end. Though what?
It's open for paleoartists if they want to do enormous fans with a lot of colors and hearts. You are free to do it, because it's quite likely.
So on the subject of paleoartists, now there's a segue. You do lots of artwork too. It's great, and I know we'd obviously say that for a guest this, but as you know full well, I've literally bought art off you and commissioned artwork. So you're doing something right. You're selling it to other academics. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the stuff you do is highly stylized, which I think is kind of coming more and more. Like I see, you saw none of this 5 years ago, and now there's several of you doing lots of this stuff, where it's, very heavily stylized. Not cartoony necessarily, but also not hyper-realistic. And that doesn't mean... Sorry, this is turning into a very long and protracted sentence. But it's I'm trying to convey for people who haven't seen it, that, it's almost kind of like Olympic logo-y or stuff like that, where it's like, it's very obvious exactly what it is, and yet at the same time, you can't go, oh, well, that's the knee joint, and that's the hair, and that's, it is both accurate, but also interpretative. You're nodding and you haven't pulled a face, so I'm assuming that's not an awful explanation of your style.
I mean, I'm going a lot with Russian Soviet constructivism and Polish poster art movement. They're my inspirations, which are the weirdest thing to quote as Paleoart inspiration, but it's sort of like those artworks I grew up with, because when I grew up in Poland, it's sort of, I guess, imprinted on themselves. So it's a representation of something using abstract shapes, but those abstract shapes communicate the technical knowledge you wanted to say, which we usually back then used for propaganda and sort of reconstruction of architecture, reflecting the kind of cubic, minimalist Bauhaus style of housing. So for some reason, I'm completely obsessed with that area of design, because I grew up in housing that was creating this kind of style, and I absolutely hated it. And I'm interested in things that I dislike and hate. So I just...
That's why you want to work with Dave. It's the same for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, this sounds perfect for pterosaurs generally.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be very self-hating to be working with pterosaurs. They're not the friendliest of things to be working with.
Yes, all the other pterosaur researchers.
I mean, there's a reason a lot of pterosaur researchers turn evil. But there's high degree of, within paleontologists, if there's a bad egg, they usually work on pterosaurs.
It is genuinely true, like as someone who works on not that I think I'm evil, but yes.
I hope I am not as well.
I think it's fair to say, I think it's obviously, the reality is it's just random. Pterosaurs are a really small field. There's only a handful of people doing it. And so if you roll the dice for the number, for any, mammoths or fossil snakes or perciform fish, whatever it is, sooner or later you're going to roll a lot of ones. But it is notorious. Like, you go to conferences and, like, whoever's talking about pterosaurs comes up and everyone's like looking at each other going, ooh, who's going to start a fight? Because they know almost whoever it is speaking, there's 3 or 4 people sitting in the audience who profoundly dislike either the person or what they're about to say, or both. And outside of hominid research, which is absolutely cutthroat and brutal, and that's terrifying even to me, like, pterosaur research has this frankly deserved reputation of having a lot of people in it who are they disagree with one another, and not necessarily in a civil manner.
I think you mean forthright.
Right. Yes, they are forthright in their opinions of one another's character and ability as researchers.
Well, I mean, everybody wants to get in it. It's a cutthroat industry, obviously. This is thousands and millions of people want to, like, there should be an X Factor, shouldn't there? That'd sort it out.
Come and work on a handful of flat things that no one cares about. Yeah,
we care. We have listeners who prove we care because they actually listen. So, it matters.
Yes.
But I love the fact that you've actually, taken one art inspiration, mixed it with a load of another inspiration, which is paleontology, and have made something entirely unique. I think it's really nice to see. I think that's one thing that Instagram and the visual sharing of lots of media has done. It's really forced artists in a way to really, like, not only explore lots of different styles, but really find their style and extend that, beyond what you might have otherwise done had you been left on your own, not seeing what other people are doing.
Yeah, I think internet has been reason for the new dinosaur paleoart, of just paleoart, for instance. There's no longer a requirement of somebody to be a paleoartist and be published, because you can just put things on Twitter and that will get traction even if you have many followers or not. If there's something unique and interesting, everything, you already can build up your brand or artistic identity. Because back then it was already, if you wanted to get a published illustration in book or for publication, there were only some artists that already were within the social circles that you could connect with. But with the internet, anybody can publish anything and be within this social circles. There's no longer this ivory tower kind of accessibility. So suddenly you have much more characters and much more people being more experimental. Because also if you have slightly different style, it's easier to break through and, catch someone's eyes. Because there has been out of realistic or hyper-realistic representations, which I understand why they're important and why people resonate with them, because we are dealing with something extinct and it'll be amazing to see it as it was in real life. But also there's a lot of value in doing things slightly differently and exposing it to slightly different audiences, because a lot of people say like, oh, I never could picture something like a pterosaur, but I'm seeing your artwork, which is very abstract, and suddenly it sort of clicks in my head like other artwork couldn't, because we all perceive things differently, and also that goes to art, because art is in a way reading, and if we can write things in different languages, people can read them also. So it's also increasing accessibility by increasing style and diversity of the way how we portray things. At least I'd like to think so.
Well, don't you also, though, get a lot of people going, well, actually, it wouldn't look like a Soviet poster. Actually, the dinosaurs were into capitalism and Ayn Rand. They're much more Picasso-like or something. I don't know.
But at least in, not really answering your question, but at least in another way, it's also the online thing means that people are doing it for themselves. If you wanted to be an artist, you would, a paleo artist being paid to do it, as close to photorealism was the only thing people ever wanted, other than maybe a cartoon occasionally. And therefore that was the only thing that was worth drawing. Whereas now, because you can reach that audience of random people who might apparently give you money if you're lucky, but even if you're not, just because of your own interest, just to stick it on DeviantArt, you can. And I think that actually permits people to go and investigate and develop their own interests in their own style, because they're not trying to become necessarily professionals. And that I imagine is driving at least some of this.
There's no this pressure of demand and supply, because people just create their own work, and if that resonates with someone, suddenly sort of jettisoned in a slightly different direction. And you can see it with how Paleoart scene is changing, especially on Twitter and DeviantArt. There's no longer just one people replicating each other's style and just sort of everybody trying to be next RJ Palmer. Everybody sort of finding their own niches, and that actually I think that's helpful to the field to diversify and attract other audiences, especially with things like we know that dinosaurs and pterosaurs were kind of cooly, they're furry, and suddenly this kind of macho masculine theropods with gnarling teeth and out of gore is sort of disappearing, and you can attract other audiences, especially outside of the hyper-masculine circles, to access the field and engage with it, even if it's not in academic sense, if it's purely hobbyist or just people looking at cute picture of animals. That's already making people engage with sciences even casually. So you bring somebody to be interested in science without actually try being scientific. You just put nice pictures of cute animals, and that's somebody's already resonating with up-to-date science. So I think that's super, super useful. I'm glad this kind of community is sort of exploding, and even much younger people than me, like 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds, they'll upload things on DeviantArt and Twitter. They're scary how good they are. So I'm very looking forward to the new generation of paleoartists, because we are now at the start of this kind of renaissance. In 10 years' time, I can't wait to see how that will reflect on book publications, on portraits of prehistoric characters in the media. I'm sort of expecting a lot of diversity in style and also execution of how we translate science and deal with reconstruction of animals.
If anybody's listening and wants to start off the hashtag cottagecore pterosaur, I would love to see cute, like ruralistic jam-making pterosaurs being all sort of like surrounded by fluffy things. That would be amazing.
But set against East European brutalist architecture.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
yeah.
They've got to be wearing a gingham dress whilst doing their jam making, but behind a solid wall of concrete.
See, I don't think pterosaurs would wear dresses because their tails wouldn't show. This is the thing. But gingham, sure. I mean, picnicking, definitely. And with that...
Now that's how you end a podcast.
So your art and everything else, can people follow you on things so they can check it out? And when's this new paper going to be out? And tell us more.
Don't ask PhD students
that question. When this paper comes out, it's a taboo topic.
You know that. Don't never ask a woman X, never ask a man X. Don't ask a PhD student when is it going to be done.
Is it going to be soon? Is it soon? Is it?
I mean, depends how you define soon. It's a spectrum.
Geologically, yes.
On geological scale, it is immediate.
You're like Aslan, you call all time soon. I understand. But no, your art and stuff, can people find you places? And that's...
Yeah, I'm too active on Twitter, so it's Rye Critic, and it's a terrible name. I just picked it up when I was starting my...
Spell it out.
W-R-Y, Rye.
Rye Critic.
Cool.
W-R-Y Critic,
But
yeah.
we'll put the link in the description.
Yeah, check the notes.
And I also have my website over this, which is sort of, you go on that site and there's all of stuff you can follow. And yeah, that's about it.
That was amazing. So thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you for visiting Terrible Lizard. Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Terrible Lizards podcast. To support the show, share this episode and leave us a review, especially with dinosaur emojis, on your app of choice. You can also become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards, where you'll be rewarded with extra content. For more information about Dave and Izzy and our books, other podcasts and blogs, please visit terriblelizards.co.uk. We hope to keep making this content, and it's down to your support that we do, so thank you.